The journey has been long and the path difficult, but the final resolution is finally within your reach at the end of the road. Stay with us as we piece together the last bit of the puzzle. Hit subscribe now and witness the most important ending.
The text came through right as my sister was laughing at something my father said. I felt my phone buzz against my thigh, under the table, and almost ignored it. We were in the middle of dinner, the kind of dinner where ignoring your phone is the polite thing to do. But something made me look down. Maybe it was the fact that the text was from my dad, who was sitting directly across the table from me and never texted during meals. He had a rule about it. I tilted the screen so only I could see it. Don't let Chloe drink any more of that wine. Take her glass. Tell her you want to try it. Do it now, please. I read it twice, then I looked up. My father was watching me from across the table, his face completely calm, his dinner napkin still folded in his lap. Around him, everything was normal. My mother was passing the bread basket. My brother-in-law was telling a story about a road trip he'd taken with their kids last summer. And my sister Chloe, the birthday girl, was leaning back in her chair with her cheeks flushed and her wineglass half full, laughing at something that had happened before. I read the text. She looked happy, relaxed, 40 years old and genuinely glowing. I looked back at my father. He gave me one small deliberate nod. My hands went cold. I'm not someone who panics. I'm a nurse practitioner. I've spent 12 years making calm decisions, in moments when calm is the hardest thing to be. But something about the way my father looked at me, steady, urgent, certain, made my stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with instinct. I reached across the table and picked up Chloe's glass. Can I steal a sip? I said. I want to see what you're drinking. She waved her hand generously. Take the whole glass. Dwight brought it. It's really good. I smiled and held the glass. I didn't drink. Dwight. I glanced toward the far end of the table, where my father's old friend sat with his own glass of water. Water, I realized, not wine, cutting into his salmon. He'd arrived at Chloe's birthday dinner with an expensive bottle of red, wrapped in tissue paper and tucked inside a black velvet bag. He'd insisted on opening it himself. He'd poured Chloe's glass personally, full and generous. He'd been cheerful all evening. More cheerful than I remembered him being at the handful of family events where I'd seen him over the years. That cheerfulness. There was something off about it now. If you're wondering how I ended up at dinner with a man I barely knew, here's the context. My father, Ted, spent most of his working life in the construction industry. About 15 years ago, he and Dwight had co-owned a mid-sized general contracting firm outside Columbus. They'd been friends for years before that. Neighbors once. The kind of relationship where you trust someone not because you've verified everything about them, but because you've watched them show up, over and over, and they've never given you a reason to doubt them. Except that they had, Dwight had. My father just didn't know it yet. The short version is this. Dwight had been skimming money from the company for years. Small amounts at first. The kind that get lost in overhead and vendor payments. Then, larger ones. When the housing market crashed and the company's finances were suddenly under a microscope, an outside auditor found the discrepancies. My father cooperated fully with the investigation. He gave the authorities everything they asked for. He didn't even realize, at the time, that cooperating was something Dwight would never forgive him for. Dwight was convicted of embezzlement and fraud. He served 4 years in a federal correctional facility in Elkton, Ohio. His wife left before the trial even started. The house in Bexley went into foreclosure. He lost everything by his own hand and then spent every year afterward deciding it was my father's fault. My father didn't know any of this, not the full weight of it, until that night. He knew Dwight had reconnected with him a few months earlier, showing up at his hardware store one afternoon. Older and quieter, saying he just wanted to move on. My father, because he is the kind of man who genuinely believes in second chances, had taken him at his word. So when Chloe's 40th birthday came around and my father mentioned to Dwight that the family was celebrating at the Millbury, a restaurant in Dublin, with private dining rooms and good wine, Dwight had offered to come, just to say hello, just to celebrate. And my father had said yes. I didn't know any of that backstory that night. All I knew was that I was sitting at a birthday dinner with a glass of wine in my hand. That my father had urgently asked me not to let my sister drink. And I was trying very hard to look like nothing was wrong. My brother-in-law finished his road trip story. My mother laughed. Chloe reached toward me, and for a moment I thought she was going to take the glass back. But she just patted my arm and said, "You've barely touched anything tonight. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said, just pacing myself. She laughed and turned back to the table. My phone buzzed. "Something is wrong. I don't know what yet. Don't let anyone drink from that bottle. I'll explain. Just trust me." I set the wine glass down slightly behind my place setting, out of reach of Chloe's hand. Across the table, my father wasn't looking at me anymore. He was watching Dwight, not obviously. He was still holding his fork, still making eye contact with whoever was speaking, but his attention had shifted in a way I recognized from childhood. My father had a way of going very still when something required his full focus. He went still like that now. I started watching Dwight, the way my father was watching him. He'd barely touched his salmon. He'd refilled Chloe's water glass twice without being asked. He kept checking the time on his watch, a small, almost imperceptible glance at his left wrist that he repeated every few minutes. He laughed at jokes, a half-second after everyone else did, like he was monitoring the room, rather than actually in it. He wasn't drinking the wine. He had a glass in front of him. Chloe had poured it for him when he'd first opened the bottle, as a kind of return gesture, and it sat there, full, untouched, catching the candlelight. He'd taken one fake sip when Chloe made a toast, the kind where your lips touch the rim and nothing actually goes down, and then he'd set it back on the table and left it there. My pulse started to climb. I thought about the way he'd insisted on opening the bottle himself. The way he'd carried the bag in, held it close to his side, the whole time. My mother had mentioned that he'd driven separately and arrived first, that he'd been sitting at the table, waiting for everyone when they got there. I thought about the fact that he'd poured Chloe's glass before anyone else's. I thought about Chloe's flushed cheeks, which I had assumed were from happiness, and a couple of drinks. And I looked at her again now with different eyes. She was quieter than she'd been 20 minutes ago. Her eyes were heavy. She'd stopped laughing, and was nodding along to the conversation with a soft, distant smile that didn't quite reach her face. Her husband said something directly to her, and she blinked twice before answering. And the answer came out slow, the words slightly stacked on top of each other. "That wasn't how a person looks after 2 glasses of wine. That was how a person looks when something is wrong." My father's chair scraped back from the table. He stood up slowly, the way he does everything, without rushing, without drawing attention, just moving deliberately toward a thing he's already decided to do. He walked around the perimeter of the table, stopped at Chloe's side, put his hand on her shoulder, and said something quietly to her. She blinked up at him. He moved to the empty chair beside her, the one nobody was using, and sat down. Then, he reached across the table and picked up the wine bottle. He didn't make an announcement. He didn't say anything at all. He just moved the bottle and set it on the floor, behind his chair, out of the center of the table, away from the glasses. That was when Dwight noticed. The shift in his face was small, a tightening around the jaw, a recalibration behind the eyes. He set down his fork. "Ted," he said, and his voice had lost its dinner party warmth. "Everything all right?" My father looked at him. "I'm not sure yet," he said. "Chloe, how are you feeling?" I asked from across the table. She turned toward me too slowly. "A little weird," she said. "Like dizzy, I don't know." She pressed her fingers to her temple. It came on fast. Her husband was paying attention now. He put his hand on her arm. "Honey?" Chloe shook her head, but the motion seemed to cost her something. "I'm fine, I just need..." She stopped. Her hand dropped from her temple. My mother said her name. I was already on my feet. I know the difference between someone who has had too much to drink and someone whose central nervous system is in trouble. The way Chloe's eyes were moving. The way her breathing had gone shallow. The slowness of her responses. This was not 2 glasses of wine. Something was suppressing her neurological function, and it was doing it fast. "We need to call 911, I said. I said it to my brother-in-law, Directly, clearly, no room for misinterpretation. My mother made a sound. My brother-in-law's face went white. He already had his phone out. My father stood up again. He moved to the restaurant entrance. We were in a private room with glass walls and a door that closed, and waved down the hostess. Within 30 seconds, a manager was in the room. Dwight stood up too. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to explain. He just pushed back his chair and started moving toward the door with his coat in his hand. My father stepped into the doorway before he got there. He didn't grab him. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood in the opening with his arms at his sides, 64 years old, and looked at him. "I think you should stay," he said. Dwight's jaw worked. "Ted, I don't know what you think is happening, but—" "The wine," my father said. "You brought it in a sealed bag. You insisted on opening it yourself. You poured Chloe's glass before anyone else's and you kept refilling it. And you haven't taken a single real sip all night." He paused. "If there is absolutely nothing wrong with that wine, I'd like you to go over to that bottle right now and pour yourself a full glass and drink it." The room went quiet. Dwight didn't move. "That's what I thought," my father said. The paramedics arrived 9 minutes later. I know because I timed it on my phone while I knelt next to Chloe and held her hand and talked to her in the steadiest voice I could manage, telling her to stay with me, telling her she was okay. Her husband sat on her other side, holding her arm, not letting go. She was conscious but barely responsive by the time the EMTs reached her. Her blood pressure was dropping. Her oxygen saturation was low enough that they put her on supplemental O2 immediately and started an IV line. I told them everything I could: the wine, the timing, how many glasses she'd had. I told them I suspected she'd been given something in her drink. I said the word intentional. I saw the understanding pass across their faces. They took her to Ohio Health Riverside Methodist. She was there for 2 days. The police arrived at the restaurant while the ambulance was still outside. 2 officers initially, then a detective about 40 minutes later when the situation became clearer. My father gave them everything. The bottle, the bag Dwight had carried it in, Dwight's full name, the history between them, all of it. He sat at the table in that private dining room, with the birthday decorations still hanging from the ceiling, and spoke calmly and completely for almost an hour. Dwight was detained in the restaurant lobby. He didn't fight it. The fight had gone out of him the moment my father stepped into that doorway. The toxicology report came back 2 days later, while Chloe was still being monitored. The wine contained flunitrazepam. You might know it by another name, Rohypnol. It had been dissolved into the bottle in a concentration large enough to cause severe respiratory depression and unconsciousness in a person of Chloe's size, particularly after 2 full glasses. The lab's assessment was that the dose, if fully consumed over the course of the evening, could have been fatal. The bottle was a $60 California Cabernet from a wine shop in Grandview Heights. Dwight had purchased it 3 days before the dinner, and, according to his own eventual statement to investigators, had dissolved the compound into it at home, then resealed the foil over the cork. He had been planning it for months. 12 years of a grudge, crystallized into one evening, one bottle, one birthday dinner. He'd targeted Chloe because she was the one who would accept a birthday gift of wine without suspicion. Because he knew she and my father were close, and that hurting her would devastate him. He had wanted my father to watch it happen and know, afterward, that it was the price for cooperating with investigators all those years ago. That was the logic he'd been living inside of for over a decade. He was charged with attempted murder and poisoning. He pleaded guilty the following spring and was sentenced to 22 years in an Ohio state prison. He was 61 years old at sentencing. The math on that is not difficult. Chloe came home from the hospital on a Thursday. She walked through her front door under her own power, a little pale and a little quiet, and her kids threw themselves at her in the entryway, and she held on to both of them for a long time without saying anything. She recovered completely. That's the part I need you to hear. She's okay. She went back to work 3 weeks after the hospital and came home that first day, and texted me a photo of herself at her desk with a coffee cup and the caption, "Still here. Tell Dad." I forwarded it to him. He replied with a single word. "Good." But the night it happened, The night at the restaurant, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The way he'd stayed calm, not the brittle calm of someone suppressing panic, but the real kind. The kind that comes from deciding what matters and then doing it without hesitation. He had noticed something was wrong before anyone else at that table. He hadn't disrupted the dinner by making an accusation he couldn't yet prove. He hadn't caused a scene. He had sent me a text, asked me to trust him, and then he had watched and waited and gathered what he needed before he acted. And when he did act, he'd blocked a doorway with his body, and asked a man with a 12-year grudge to prove his innocence by drinking his own wine. At the hospital, in the waiting room, I sat next to him for a long time without saying much. At some point I asked him when he'd first felt something was off. He thought about it. When he opened the bottle, he said, he'd had it in that bag the whole time. Most people, when they bring wine as a gift, they hand it over and let the birthday person open it. He wanted to do it himself. I noticed, but I didn't think much of it. And then he poured Chloe's glass first and it was full. Really full. And then he sat back down and didn't pour his own. That was enough, I said. That was the start of it. He shook his head. The watch. He kept checking the time. A man who's enjoying a birthday dinner doesn't watch the clock like that. And then Chloe started to look different. He paused. You know how she looks when she's had a little too much. She gets loud and giggly and her face goes red. She wasn't doing any of that. She was getting quiet. That's not Chloe after 2 glasses of wine. That's something else. I thought about that. He was right. I'm a nurse practitioner, and I hadn't connected those dots in real time. He had. Sitting across from a man he'd trusted, in the middle of a birthday dinner, with nothing more than years of knowing his daughter, and a lifetime of paying attention to the world around him. Dad, I said, you saved her life. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, she's my kid. He looked down at his hands. I should have known better than to let him back in. You couldn't have known, I said. You gave him a second chance because that's who you are. That's not a flaw. He didn't look convinced. I've thought about that conversation many times in the months since. There's a version of that evening that goes differently. A version where my father notices something is off but second-guesses himself, decides it would be rude to make a scene at his daughter's birthday dinner, lets the politeness of the occasion override what he knows. A version where Chloe finishes her glass and accepts a third one, and Dwight keeps watch at the clock, and the rest of us keep laughing at stories about road trips. I can't stay in that version of the evening for long. It goes somewhere I don't want to follow. What I know is this. My father trusted what he saw. He didn't let the warmth of the occasion convince him that something wrong must actually be fine. He looked at the situation clearly, and he acted, and then he stood in a doorway with his arms at his sides and held the line until help arrived. That is a specific kind of courage that nobody talks about enough. It doesn't look like the movies. It's quiet and deliberate and it happens fast. And then it's over. And the only evidence that it was ever courage at all is that the people you love are still standing. There's a thing that happens after an experience like this where you start to see everything you almost didn't notice. I think about how many dinners any of us have sat through. Relaxed, trusting, passing food and wine around tables in restaurants and homes and backyards, never once questioning what we're being handed. Mostly that trust is warranted. Mostly people are who they appear to be. But sometimes they're not. Sometimes someone is sitting across from you, with a plan they have spent years perfecting, and the thing that saves you isn't a dramatic revelation or a lucky coincidence. It's just one person at the table still paying attention when everyone else has already settled into the warmth of the evening. That's my father. That's who he has always been. Chloe calls him every Sunday now. She always did, but it's different. Longer, fuller, the kind of call where you're not catching up on news but just being together across the distance. He doesn't make a big deal of it. He picks up and says, "Hey, kid," and they talk for as long as they want. I've started calling him more too. Not because I was frightened into gratitude, but because that night reminded me of something I already knew, and had been treating like I didn't. The people who show up for us. The ones who notice when something is wrong, who text us from across the table because they love us too much to wait. Those people are not permanent. You can't take them for granted and then suddenly appreciate them in a crisis and call it even. That's not how it works. That's not fair to them. You have to actually show up. While there's still time to show up. I think about my father standing in that doorway with no weapon and no raised voice, just his presence and the weight of a man who had already decided that nobody was leaving that room until the truth came out. 64 years old. Still and certain and completely himself. I think you should stay. 5 words, that's all it took. I want to be that kind of person. Not the loudest in the room, not the most dramatic, but the one who is paying attention when it matters. The one who trusts what they know even when everyone around them is celebrating. And the last thing in the world feels wrong, the one who acts when acting is the only thing left to do. My sister is fine. She's more than fine. She celebrated her actual birthday 3 weeks after the hospital. Takeout boxes on the living room floor. A grocery store cake with 40 candles. Her kids insisting on counting every single one before she blew them out. She laughed so hard that night she cried. The real kind of crying that comes from relief and joy, and the particular feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be. My father sat on the couch and watched her, and didn't say much. Because he is not a man who says much when something has already been handled. But at the end of the night, when everyone else was cleaning up and Chloe was helping her youngest carry paper plates to the trash, my father sat next to me on the couch, and after a moment he said, very quietly, "I'm glad I noticed." I put my hand on his arm and said, "I'm glad you trusted yourself." He nodded once, the way he does, and that was the whole conversation. It was enough. It has always been enough.